He's John Timpane.
And he's Don Rooney.
And this is
the Musical Innertube.
Now, you may ask, why is this podcast called the Musical Innertube?
And we may reply, because that's its name, of course.
Now, how did this podcast get that name?
Back in college, we hosted a radio show. Once, we tried to introduce a soothing musical interlude.
Instead, we messed up and wound up introducing a soothing musical innertube, and the name stuck.
So here we are, hundreds of years later, still talking
to interesting people about their interesting lives.
Difference makers who really make a difference.
And today we're talking with Robert Thompson, who is a professor of all things media at Syracuse University. Bob, welcome again to the Musical Innertube. Thanks for coming back.
Hey, back again. Thanks.
Let's talk about the streaming services. That was the thing that I think caught most people's eyes as the summer went on, is that Netflix is fading. It's losing members. It's ready to charge or at least put ads on in order to help it boost it up. Some of the other services are kind of wobbly too. I read an article from someone who said, we're right back where we were with cable. We've got 100 channels. We watch very little on it, and we're starting to pay more and more for less and less. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, yes. Okay. So there's a couple of things there. First of all, the last thing you said is, yes, I remember a few years ago, the kind of glory days that we were going to be able to cut the cord of cable, and suddenly we would have all of this bounty of programming, and it was going to be so much cheaper, and we'd be able to choose what we wanted and all of that kind of thing. Well, very quickly, of course, streaming services began to proliferate. It wasn't just Netflix. You needed to watch Friends and The Office and new programming and movies and all that kind of stuff. But you started having to subscribe to all these other things. If you just wanted to watch all the shows that have been nominated in the major categories for the upcoming Emmys, just those programs, you would need, I think, at least 5 different subscriptions to do that. So there is a sense now that we used to pay one bill to our cable company, and we cut the cord for that, or many people cut the cord for that. And now we're simply paying many different bills to many different subscription services. And it is really slouching toward pretty much the same percentage of our income as before. And it's continuing. Disney just announced that its Disney Plus is going from $7.99 to $10.99. Now, that may only be $3, but that's a big percentage. That starts in December 8th. They're also going to then, for $7.99, offer an ad-supported tier, which, of course, Netflix has been talking about. Hulu's been doing for a long time. Speaking of Hulu, it's going up December from $12.99 to $14.99, and the cheap with ads going up from $6.99 to $7.99. So we always learned about Newton and gravity and what goes up must come down. That is the opposite law for streaming and cable. What goes up will continue to go up. And also, as we get all of these other, new, just not that many years ago, there was no HBO Max, there was no Paramount, there was no Disney Plus for that matter. So there's more and more of these one has to get, and the price is going up. So the old days of cable and cable expenses, I suppose, have come around again.
They've just moved to a different part of the playing field. Yeah. I mean, this I associate this with the constant pressure to download and or purchase apps, because a lot of the things that one used to get for free have now moved over to these streaming services, and you can't get them unless you pay for them. And every time you use almost any kind of service, they're pressing you to download your app too. And it's not very long before your iPhone has 50 apps on it. I was just looking at mine, and I'm just flipping through pages and pages of apps. And there's 2 things, Bob, I want to ask you about. First of all, from what you're seeing, how are consumers responding to these changes? First of all, are they going along with them or not?
Well, we see, you had mentioned Netflix from the very beginning, and Netflix has lost some subscribers, which seemed like that could never happen. And there are people, obviously, who are having to make decisions. I'm sure all of us have anecdotal evidence of people who have finally decided that they can't afford all of these things together, so they decide which ones to cancel, and then they cancel one for a while until a new hit comes out, and then they start that again, and it's a musical chairs of your streaming services. But, some of this, the whole kind of premature announcement of the death of Netflix. Netflix had a bunch of bad numbers come in all in a row, and immediately people were writing the obituary of Netflix. I think that's probably premature. For one thing, we are going to reach saturation points of these things. The streaming universe is really, really young still, and we had these extraordinary growth periods because nobody had streaming services started, and of course you had every single person in the population as your potential new market. Netflix had gotten to the point where if you hadn't subscribed to Netflix yet, you probably weren't going to subscribe. They were going to reach a peak. There are only so many human beings on planet Earth that can subscribe to Netflix. And when you get to a certain point, there's not a lot of places for growth. So they are looking, of course, at international situations. They are looking for people who would maybe pay if it were less. That's going to be the ad-supported tier. And most of all, I think Netflix is really trying to figure out how to get all those people who really like Netflix and who can't live without Netflix, but who don't happen to be paying for Netflix, the whole password sharing and all of that. And if they can figure that out, that, of course, could give them another boost. But eventually, you can't keep growing. You can't grow every single year new subscribers in a population that's finite.
We have a situation now where all of the major network players in TV now have streaming services. CBS has Paramount Plus, NBC has Peacock, ABC has a stake in Hulu, Disney has Disney Plus, Fox has streaming services as well. And it seems what happens is the prestige dramas and comedies, the scripted shows, are now all on the streaming services. And when you go to the over-the-air networks, you get stuff like Ninja Warrior and America's Got Talent and Can You Name That Tune? All of the free, cheap stuff is on the airwaves, and the good prestige stuff now is on the streaming services where you have to pay for it. Am I right in making that assumption?
You are right, but that dichotomy had happened already in when cable came along. And it's interesting how it's very complex how it happened. So we had network television, and up until the 1970s and really up till the 1980s, network TV was trying to appeal to everybody. Pretty much all of it could be seen by an 8-year-old and therefore had to be not that much more complex than that. And the whole thing that you're calling prestige drama, quality TV as it was once called, really starts off, I think, in the early 80s with Hill Street Blues that debuted in January of 81. Yeah. And that was followed by St. Elsewhere and Moonlighting and 30-something. By 10 years into that, we had Twin Peaks. This was on Broadcast Network, a series by David Lynch, who was considered one of those inaccessible art house directors. In the 70s, the idea of giving David Lynch a broadcast network television program would have seemed absolutely absurd. But by the time we get to the 90s, networks are beginning to carve out this prestige area. Long before cable got into this, by the way, when the networks in the 80s were doing stuff like Hill Street Blues and St. Elsewhere, on commercial television, amazingly enough, HBO was just starting to get into original series with shows like The Hitchhiker, which was kind of a really low-rent Twilight Zone, which had naked female breasts on it because they could do it. First and 10, starring Delta Burke and O.J. Simpson. Oh, that had been good. Really wasn't until about 88 when they got Robert Altman and Gary Trudeau, a great film auteur and a legendary comic artist, to do a show called Tanner 88. And then, of course, they moved into the 90s with Oz, and then Sex and the City and The Sopranos, and then The Wire. And now, of course, by that time, HBO had become the big prestige place. But even though the networks started this in the 1980s, cable quickly took on the mantle of quality stuff, both premium cable, obviously, with networks like HBO, but also basic cable, AMC and FX, things like The Shield, and then later Mad Men and Breaking Bad and all of that. So you're right. Broadcast networks are now very much going back to their roots in the 50s and 60s with these game shows and talent competitions. America's Got Talent, which consistently really does well in the summer. Forget going back to the early days of television with Ted Mack's original Amateur Hour. It's just back to the days of radio. Believe it or not, there was actually audience participation. You didn't text such and such for whoever you voted for. They gave you a box office number in New York City, which you'd send the postcard to, which would determine that Pat Boone was going to win the original Amateur.
Looking forward in the future, does this continue? And if so, like you said, with all of the different streaming services charging different prices, and you have to subscribe to so many of them to find the programs that you want to watch, does this coalesce, do you see, in the future? Is there some way in which somebody can pay the way they did with cable, one price to get many channels?
Wouldn't that, and I guess we call those bundles now, within corporate entities. So Disney, ESPN, Hulu, there's a whole bunch of different pricing structures where you can bundle them together. But isn't it kind of funny how the thing everybody used to complain about with cable was that you had to buy a bundle? And what if I don't want to watch the Golf Channel? And what if I don't care about QVC? And apparently, streaming was going to solve all that problem. And we are, in many ways, slouching toward because there is a convenience about, that was what was so exciting about Netflix. When it first came out, there were some other services and everything, but Netflix was really kind of one-stop shopping. I mentioned The Office and Friends before, because for all of the fancy programming on these streaming, those were the two top shows watched on Netflix until they lost them, one to HBO Max, the other to Peacock. But there was a couple of glorious years there when if you had Netflix, you could get a lot of movies and a lot of old TV and some exciting new TV and Orange is the New Black and House of Cards and all of that kind of stuff. And now, of course, all of these places that were supplying that content said, why should we let Netflix be the middleman in this when we can have our own streaming services? So now, just like we had ABC, NBC, CBS in radio, then we had it in television, and now we've got it in streaming. As for whether they're going to consolidate, I mean, it almost seems like a breathing, inhaling and exhaling sort of organism. Netflix starts as kind of this one-stop shopping, and then we get all this proliferation. I suspect there is going to be some consolidation of some of these. The big three, of course, are Netflix and Disney. Disney, by the way, which is right now dead tied for global subscribers with Netflix. That happened pretty quickly. And then Prime Video is not too much further. And little Peacock is down there at 27 million.
Hello, yeah. I'm here.
Yeah. Peacock doesn't seem to have done it.
Need all those colorful feathers.
I mean, I look at Peacock. Okay, so I look at Peacock and I have two feelings. One is there's nothing there that I want to see. And the other is that what I want to see there and what they're forcing me to pay for is one of my favorite sports, which is Premier League soccer, right? And you don't see almost any Premier League soccer suddenly on cable. And now I'm sort of mad that I have to now suddenly I have to pay for the privilege. And they're starting to do that with local baseball games as well. I noticed Apple Plus is starting to take some baseball games over, and I have a feeling they're going to take my sport away from me. I'm not that happy about that, Bob.
They're not taking it away. It's just that they're making you pay for it. And there was that whole period of broadcasting, which starts with the first television or the first radio network, NBC, gets formed in 1926, thereabouts. And that moved seamlessly to television, and you had all of the major networks. But that period from the late 20s, really through, for all intents and purposes, well into the 1980s, this idea that we got used to all of this programming, from the Oscars to the Super Bowl to sports of every type to sitcoms and dramas and game shows and soap operas, and all of it only cost what it cost to pay your electric bill and to buy a television set. That was it. And then, of course, the major price was it was interrupted with all of these jingles and commercials and all the rest of it. Half the time, those themselves had entertainment value, the Super Bowl being the supreme example of that. Yeah. Many people like commercials better than the game. So we had this period where several generations of people got used to the fact that it was almost an entitlement, like it was one of the things the Declaration mentions in the pursuit of happiness, that we were going to get all this stuff without paying for it if we were going to deal with the interruptions and the commercials, which, by the way, we learned to work with. You'd go to the bathroom or you'd go and take something out of the microwave. People learned to figure that out. Then cable came along and really changes that whole equation. Cable, of course, had commercials in most of the channels anyway, unless it was premium. But you got it. You got more choices and all of that kind of thing. Streaming now brings us back to a much more standard commercial interaction, which is if you want something, you pay for it. And streaming, remember pay-per-view. There still has pay-per-view, but I remember when that first came out, the idea that you would pay usually a pretty expensive price, and then you'd get a great boxing match or some such thing. So, all of this idea that what was once free isn't free anymore. It was never free. It's just the various business models are beginning to change. Or not beginning, they're well in the midst of their change.
More with Robert Thompson in just a moment. But first, this soothing musical Innertube.
Robert Thompson is the founding director of the Bleier Center for Television and Popular Culture and a trustee professor of television and popular culture at Syracuse University. He was a visiting professor for 6 summers at Cornell University, and he served for 9 years as professor and director of the NHSI Television and Film Institute at Northwestern University.
Robert is the general editor of an ongoing series of books about television published by Syracuse University Press. He is the former president of the National Popular Culture Association and lectures across the country on the subject of television and popular culture.
He is the author or editor of 5 books: Television's Second Golden Age, Prime Time, Prime Movers, Adventures on Prime Time, and Television Studies. You can email Robert at rthompso, that's R. Thompson without the N, rthompso at syr.edu.
And now, more of the Musical Innertube.
Let me paint a scenario for you, Bob. I have a granddaughter who's older now, but when she was about 6, we went for a family outing and stayed in a hotel. And she and her parents were in one room, and my wife and I were in another. And we go down to breakfast, and my son says, "All right, here's what happened this morning." My daughter, my granddaughter, gets up. She goes over to the TV. She turns it on, and she starts trying to find her favorite cartoon, but it's not on. And she wants to know why she can't find her favorite cartoon, because she's watching a television that is feeding her the programming that it wants, and she can't do what she does at home: find her favorite cartoon, watch it, pause it while she goes and does something else, come back and pick it up later. I mean, her viewing patterns are ingrained now to the way things are being presented, which is you find what you want to see it when you want to see it, you pause it when you need to go to the bathroom and come back, and you don't miss anything. And that's not the model that the rest of us grew up on, which is TV feeds you what you want or what it wants you to see.
And that story is a a little slice of what I think has been an absolutely breathtaking change. I remember when I was still in college. I was in college from 77 to 81. And the VCR was kind of out there, but it was really expensive. It was just being introduced. We didn't have them. And I remember taking a film class, and everybody was talking about Citizen Kane this and Citizen Kane that, and the greatest movie ever made. I desperately wanted to see Citizen Kane. There was no library you could go see it in. There was no shelf that you could take it off of. You had to wait until some network or some local station played it at 2:30 a.m. When they played all those old movies. And then you had to set your alarm and watch it, or be lucky enough to live in some big city that had old movie houses and that kind of thing. We forget that it's been in the memories of comparatively young people that, unlike a book, which you can get and take down off of a shelf, if you wanted to see a movie, you had to see it while it was in the theater, or maybe catch it when it played on TV. If you wanted to watch Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, you had to watch it on December 7th or 6th or whenever they played it, or you had to wait till the next year. The whole idea that film and television was not something that we could store and watch when we wanted. That is a huge difference that took place, really, in many ways, during the 1980s. By the way, to the benefit, I think, of the art of certainly of television, when anybody that made TV thought nobody was going to see it except the one time it played, and then maybe in a rerun. Suddenly, when the idea was that people were going to be going over these things, you could examine them, you could become super fans and all the rest of it. That changes the whole dynamic of the relationship between the artist and the medium.
Is the trouble that Netflix and some of the other ones are having right now? There's been a lot of things in the last few weeks about HBO Max canceling some already produced movies that they were ready to put on and deciding not to put them on. Like there was a Batgirl movie, I think, that they were going to stream, and they decided against it because they'd merged with Discovery, and Discovery's trying to cut costs. So
all of the internet is still clutching its pearls over that announcement.
Yeah, they really are. They're just upset as hell about it. Kevin Smith even took to the airwaves, and he never says anything about anything. But it does the pursuit of all that original programming and the cost involved with it. Is that part of the reason that the streaming services find themselves in trouble right now?
Well, that was part of the business plan, which is when streaming started and when we looked at kind of the early Netflix model. The idea was, if you're going to get people to subscribe, you had to give them enough stuff that they couldn't live without. And unlike the old network days where you just needed a few hits and you built a schedule around it, you had to get people to finally throw up their arms and cry uncle and subscribe. For me, I had access to all the movies I needed. I had access to a lot of stuff. When Netflix put out House of Cards, and then when they followed up a couple months later with Orange is the New Black, when they started really getting into the original streaming series, that's when I finally had to, you could not live without Netflix. So the idea is everybody wants to get their chunk of real estate. It's like one of those old land grab periods, the homesteading era. Everybody is heading out to this new frontier, wanting to put a fence around their particular number of subscribers before the whole West is settled, kind of thing. And that means you spend a lot ahead of time. You get people subscribing and all of that, and then you hope to rely on your bench of stuff. So that is very much a part of it. And all of these streaming services know that the beginning is going to lose money. To me, most interesting things that have come from streaming that I particularly am interested in, it's a cultural thing. It is true that we can now, as you point out, see not only most of the history of television, but even the obscure oddments between YouTube and all the streaming services and film and all this stuff. Never before have we have access to an archive on demand that of all of this kind of thing. But oddly enough, just as streaming has given us more opportunity for that than we've ever had. It is almost completely taken away all of that history from most people. Here's an example. Most of my students up until, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, they were young students. They weren't alive during the period when these shows aired, but all of them would have seen I Love Lucy, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, All in the Family. Just like I, who was not born when these things were made, grew up having seen The Three Stooges and I Love Lucy, which was on before I was born. So before streaming, we not only saw the cultural material on film and TV of our own time and generation, we also saw the stuff of our parents and our grandparents' generation, because before you had on-demand by menu, like you were talking about the child wanting to know why the TV won't show Paw Patrol when she wants it. Before that, you'd come home from school and you'd flip through, 6 or 7 things, and cable, maybe even more. And there'd be news on one, you weren't interested. There'd be something else on another, you weren't interested. And then you'd fall on a rerun of The Brady Bunch or a rerun of Mary Tyler Moore. And then cable comes along, and Nick at Night and TV Land brought that to a whole new generation of people. So up until relatively recently, everybody kind of was forced to have a certain literacy of our film and television history because they didn't have that much choice. Now, way more opportunity to see that. But what one of my 20-year-old students, when they sit down with their device or on their laptop or whatever, and they've got all of the new stuff on Netflix, all the new stuff on Hulu, all of this fancy stuff, which one of them are ever going to accidentally tolerate a rerun from the 1990s? I can even in my class right now, I can go, I can make the comment, what you talking about, Willis? Or did I do that? And nobody will respond. That was before their time, and streaming has made it possible for them never to be forced to revisit that again.
I've heard stories where teachers such as yourself are complaining that kids don't know who Johnny Carson is, or Arthur Godfrey, or anybody who
Carson and Godfrey. They don't know who Letterman is.
Oh yeah, that's even worse.
Well, I have to say, Bob, that might be a mental issue with Letterman. He doesn't seem to know who he is either. I'm just
either Santa Claus or Moses by the looks of him.
Yeah,
I love the beard.
The beard keeps going. It's something that keeps on giving. I want to also mention something that just this week I heard an interview with Amy Heckerling, the director. She did Fast Times at Ridgemont High and other things, and she had said
that in class 2 weeks ago.
Oh, well, there you go.
One of the made a TV version of that. It lasted about 10 minutes. It was really horrible.
It really was.
All past times.
She mentioned in this interview that I heard where she was talking about the $1 Million Movie, which was what local stations in LA and New York and maybe some other places, but definitely LA and New York. John and I remember watching it in LA. Sure. It would show the same movie every night at 7:00 all week long. And then on Saturday, it would run it like 4 times in a row, right, beginning at noon. So if you wanted to see a movie, Godzilla or the Marx Brothers or whatever they were showing, you could see it over and over and over again. And Amy Heckerling said, that was the best film school I ever attended, was to be able to watch these movies over and over again and to get down to the minutia of figuring out shots and all that other stuff. So, again, it was a programming ploy for these stations because they didn't have to fill time. They could just run the same movie over and over again.
Or hire people.
Yeah. But on the other hand, it wound up being beneficial to the viewer.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, I agree with her 100%. And of course, now you've got that opportunity. You could watch a movie 100 times over because it's always available. But it is true. And you know what else helped kill this was the infomercial. Until 1982, the FCC didn't allow what they called program length commercials, essentially these long infomercials. So what stations would do, most of them by that time were running on a 24-hour schedule. In the really late hours when very few people were watching, they put on old movies. It was the easiest way to fill the time, and they could fill big chunks. That was first off killed off by the infomercial, because then they could actually get paid to run an infomercial as opposed to whatever. But my film education, I remember in college, I would circle in the local TV listings all the movies that were on, most of them in the middle of the night, and I would watch them, and there'd be commercials. I saw The Godfather for the first time on a little black and white TV, interrupted with commercials with all the swearing taken out of it. I saw The Graduate the first time on that same television. Not the optimal way to see those movies, but at least I was able to see them. And part of it was because there was a finite number of choices, and they were available. That whole dynamic has changed completely. On a structural level, we are way better off now. We can watch so much stuff, infinitely more practically, and we can watch it when we want, with one notable exception, which we couldn't end this conversation without saying, is for all of the bounty and for all of the accessibility, and we got into this a little bit before, there is the ugly secret that this has turned the whole panoply of entertainment and the history and movies and film and everything more and more into the good old-fashioned American dream of haves and have-nots. In other words, it used to be if you could scrounge up the funds for a radio or later a television, you could see this stuff for free. You tolerated the commercials. When Sesame Street was developed in the late 1960s, it was aimed at a specific audience of people who could see it for free, and who may have been not able to see it if they had to pay for it. And now, again, I look at all the wonderful stuff that is being made in television now, stuff that you can learn from, that can make you happy, that can amuse you and entertain you, and all these other great things. But it's not free. Even Sesame Street, while it still plays on PBS for free, is also got its deal with HBO Max, which helped save Sesame Street. So the one disturbing thing about this is that all this great stuff we talk about is only available to people who have the resources to pay for it.
Yes, and I would think, and that was one of the questions I had wanted to ask, is the problems that we're talking about are only problems for people who have the wherewithal to afford, I don't know, more than $1,000 a year to have all of their choices.
That's right.
A lot of people do not have that, so that cuts out lower income folks. It cuts out people who have less access to culture in general, and I'm talking about the poor and other groups like that. I don't know if anybody's even trying to correct that state of affairs.
And if anybody suggests the idea that, access to internet being a human right, that many people talk about. And I think we are now living in a world where that is, of course, makes perfect sense. Access to the internet, many people are calling a human right. If you start talking about access to streaming services as a human right, I would hate to think what conversation that would start. You can almost hear people now they want to make pay for everybody in America your tax-paying money so people can watch Emily in Paris. You can read that right in the headline. But that, as much as that does sound ridiculous, there is a sense that when you completely bifurcate a culture and give one access not only to entertainment stuff and everything, but great documentaries and culture and all the rest of it, and the other group of the population does not have access to that. That's not a healthy way to run a republic.
Definitely. Let's wrap it up then by trying to play Karnak, since some of the audience obviously has never heard of Johnny Carson.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
let's look about 2 or 3 years down the road. Where do you see this going? Is Netflix going to be again a tier with commercials and a tier without? Are all of them going to be that way? Will there be bundling? What do you see this all eventually winding up as, or at least in the short term? Where do you see it heading?
Okay, 2 or 3 years, I think we can actually make some kind of predictions. And I think, yes, we're going to see much more of this tiering where we both have income. You've got to figure out the main place of income are what people pay for their subscriptions and what the advertisers pay to get messages on there. And they're going to try to, these services are going to try to come up with all kinds of different options in which those two income streams are able to be maximized. And I think in 2 or 3 years, we're going to see that. I think we're going to also see some peaking of some of the subscribers as the streaming era goes on and gets more mature. And I think in 2 or 3 years, cable isn't going to have gone away, and even broadcast TV is not going to have gone away. That's 2 or 3 years. Getting much further than that, when we tried thinking of 10-year predictions, it is almost impossible. Even the Jetsons couldn't predict all the stuff that's happening now so quickly. Delivery systems, as one looks at the development of technology and AI and this tiny micro technology, 10 years, we may be getting Emily in Paris directly just beamed into our cerebral cortexes by that.
Yeah.
Robert Thompson of Syracuse University, thanks very much for talking with us today. And we'll all go back to watching television now that we're done with our conversation.
Sounds good. That was lots of fun.
Totally great as usual, Bob. Thank you.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Our lovely little podcast is available everywhere good podcasts are found. Listen on your favorite platform, and if you like what you hear, please give us a good rating.
And spread the word. Tell your friends about the Innertube and let them know they can subscribe to the podcast on our website, musicalinnertube.com.
There you can listen to all of our podcasts, see pictures and biographies of our guests, and contact us. You can even click on the microphone button in the lower right corner to leave us a voicemail.
And don't forget to leave your email address on our Talk to the Tube page so we can stay in touch.
And you can email us directly at musicalinnertube@gmail.com.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.